To Newsmakers, President Trump has once again said something that's raised eyebrows on the national and international stage, this time threatening North Korea with the fire and fury of the United States if North Korea continues to threaten the United States. His comments came in the wake of last week's unanimous vote by the United Nations Security Council to increase sanctions against the North. Mr. Trump's comments taking the tone of the rhetoric to the highest level yet between the two countries. What is going on? My guest now is just the guy who can answer that question. Joe Barnes is the Bonner Baker Means Fellow. Did I say that right? Bonner Baker? That's right.
Bonner Means Baker.
Bonner Means Baker. Okay. And fellow at Baker Institute, Rice University. He was a career diplomat in the State Department for 14 years, serving in several countries, including South Asia. Good morning. Good to see you as always.
Delighted to be here.
What was your thought when you first heard the comments by Mr. Trump?
My first thoughts were, I would be very careful about saying things if you're not prepared to back them up.
That seems to be what I've heard. I know that that's what Senator McCain said about that. And he was being very diplomatic. He wanted to be supportive of the president. Senator McCain, along with some other senators, have not been known to shy away from asking for military action. But even he at this point thought that maybe the president had said a little bit more than what he should have.
You know, that would be my opinion, but there's also the possibility that there's a good cop, bad cop sort of routine going on with the president being the bad cop and Secretary of State Tillerson, who's made more moderate comments, being the good cop.
A lot of people voted for President Trump because of that bravado, because of the way that he carries himself. So perhaps they would think that that's a good thing, that that persona is out there, that that tough guy's out there. The question is, how does the world stage view that?
Well, look, there's nothing wrong with being a tough guy. You got to be a tough guy or a tough woman if you want to be president of the United States. The question is, in the context of the toughness, does the toughness materially advance U.S. interests? Does it go beyond rhetoric? Does it reassure allies? Does it actually change the behavior of our adversaries?
Well, certainly the adversary that we're talking about, North Korea, their behavior has not changed at all. One would say that maybe that kind of talk is kind of tit for tat against the North Korean rhetoric. But in this case, it's taken it to a different kind of level, has it not?
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk of escalation. Not just verbal escalation, but potentially military escalation. I don't think it likely, but I think it more possible than it were, let's say, 6 months ago.
You've written about foreign policy. You've written about this administration's foreign policy, and I think one of the last times you wrote, you gave them an incomplete in terms of the grade for the foreign policy for the first 100 days, I think it was. After this, are we getting to see a clearer picture of what the foreign policy may be, or is it continue to be kind of murky as far as you're concerned?
It's a bit murky still. It's not clear to me that the administration speaks with a single voice at times, and message consistency is pretty important in foreign policy, unless you want to confuse people, and that includes allies and enemies alike.
We look at this president's foreign policy focus, and many expert observers have bemoaned the fact that there's been a lack of personnel in the State Department. As the president has gone across the country, the G20, for example, is one of those things. You pointed out we've got increased defense spending. We've got, at least the president has asked for increases in the defense spending and cuts in the State Department, and that being your former territory, how does that impact the ability of the United States to do well in understanding fully what the scene is across the world?
Look, they've got to move quickly, and they've got to really put a lot of effort in filling those senior positions. On the more general issue of the State Department, look, I've worked at the State Department. I love the State Department, but it's bloated. It has extra layers. But the question is, you know, if you remove a tumor, do you remove the entire limb? In other words, my concern is that as they move forward cutting the State Department budget, you're going to get into the real muscle and not just the fat.
There's a lot that's being made about whether the media at large reacts too much, too often to things the president says. In fact, some people, I know somebody from the State Department said, accused the media of obsessing about the president's comments. When you talk about nuclear, the potential of nuclear, he didn't say nuclear, but he pretty much indicated that. Is this an obsession, or is this something that when these kind of comments happen, you have to pay attention to it?
Look, he's the President of the United States of America. Every one of his public utterances is the foreign policy of the United States of America. You have to listen.
If he were, speaking of listening, if the president were to pick up the phone and say, Joe, I need some advice on our foreign policy in terms of how we do it, what we should stand for, and how we should put it out there, what kind of advice would you give him?
I'd say, look, Mr. President, the first thing you need to do is set up a functioning system to develop and execute foreign policy. You need to have clear delineations of areas of responsibility, and you have to have real message discipline.
AKA Twitter, or even through the State Department and the Secretary of State?
I would say that today, a lot of senior people in Washington, the first thing they do in the morning is look at the president's Twitter feed. And I think they're routinely surprised by what he says.
Isn't that an evolution in the way we communicate?
Oh, absolutely. Look, some of this has to do with the personality of the president, but a lot has to do with the way the whole transformation in the way we communicate in the United States because of the internet. Typically, politicians tend to have fairly anodyne tweets. Frankly, they have some staffer write up their tweets and then they approve them. The president writes his own.
And for better or for worse?
For better or for worse. What you see there is the real Donald Trump.
And maybe that's a good thing. You get to see the authentic Donald Trump, although his people are tracking and cleaning up some of the stuff.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not here to condemn the president, but I'm here to note that, as I mentioned before, every single word he says in public or tweets is the foreign policy of the United States of America. Mm-hmm. I think it behooves any president to be extremely circumspect and careful in such announcements.
Well noted, and I'll make sure that we get that information to the president. Maybe he'll take it to heart.
I hope so.
Joe Barnes, always good to see you. Thank you for your insight. Appreciate your service to this country, too, for many years. Just ahead.